over-the-top. No, we had no over-the-top rules. We were totally reasonable, thoughtful parents who made solid decisions at every turn.
They threw beer bottles at my car, locked me in the trailer, and said, "Jump, Opie, jump for us." That sentence froze all of Hollywood. People had always known him as an exemplary director, the kindest man in the film world. But behind that calm exterior was a life battered again and again, belittled by colleagues, pushed to exhaustion by studios, threatened for speaking the truth, and forced to smile through pain that others dared to call art. For 50 years, I learned to thank the people who hurt me, because in Hollywood, staying silent is a survival skill. The gentle smile once tied to the Andy Griffith Show had now become a symbol of endurance. Every film he directed was another way to hide a scar. When Ron Howard finally broke his silence, what echoed wasn't just a confession, it was an alarm bell for an industry long accustomed to living on illusions. And if you think this is just an ordinary confession, wait until you hear what Ron Howard is about to reveal. Something Hollywood has been trying to bury forever. 1. I wasn't afraid of the darkness in that trailer. I was afraid of the light outside, where they laughed and called my name like I had never grown up. Ron Howard said this with a distant look, his eyes unfocused, as if still seeing the harsh yellow lights of 1973 on the American Graffiti set in Petaluma, California. He was only 19 then, barely out of the shadow of being America's good son in the Andy Griffith Show. He arrived on set hoping to start over to be seen as a real actor. But Hollywood doesn't believe in growing up. To them, Ron was still just Opie, the gentle boy America had raised on screen. Those first shooting days seemed fine. George Lucas quietly directed, and Harrison Ford and Paul Le Mat, two respected senior cast members, initially seemed friendly. But things changed. During breaks, they teased him with half-joking, half-dismissive laughter. "Hey, Opie, did you bring yogurt to set today?" The crew burst into laughter. Ron forced a smile, tried to act like it was nothing, but heat rose in his chest, and his throat tightened. Days later, the jokes became sharper. Ford mixed alcohol into soda and slid the glass toward him, speaking in a slurred voice. "Drink it, Opie, don't worry. The orange juice is for kids." Paul Le Mat stood behind him, whistling and mimicking Opie's TV voice. Laughter again dry, blunt, making Ron want to disappear. He didn't react, only smiled awkwardly. In Hollywood, anger is a flaw, silence a survival tactic. Then came the night of July 15, 1973. A scene was delayed due to a blackout. Ron returned to his trailer to rest, but before he could close the door, he heard the crash of beer bottles against the wall. "Jump, Opie, show us how you jump," someone shouted mockingly. Before he understood what was happening, the door was locked from outside. Laughter erupted. Cans rolled on the ground. Ron stood still, his back against the door, his hand trembling on the handle. In the darkness, he heard his heartbeat mixed with the voices of people who just hours earlier had called him friend. When the lights came back, everything ended as abruptly as it began. The next morning, Ford patted his shoulder. "Just a joke, kid." Ron smiled, nodded, and walked off set with an empty feeling. He told no one, not Lucas, not his parents, not even himself. He only knew that from that day on, whenever someone called him Opie, his chest tightened, as if the air was being squeezed from his lungs. The film premiered that August and became a cultural phenomenon. The media called Ron Howard an icon of American youth, from Opie to movie star. But behind the praise, he felt only emptiness. In a cast photo taken for The Hollywood Reporter, Ron stood slightly angled, his gaze a little off the camera, a small detail no one noticed except him. In his journal after the premiere, he wrote, "I laughed with them, but I couldn't hear my own laughter anymore." and then, like a reflex, he chose silence. When reporters asked about the filming experience, he said, "Wonderful, the crew was great." When asked about the pressure of being a child star, he replied, "I was luckier than most." Silence became a habit, a way to survive. But inside, the wound kept bleeding. During later auditions after American Graffiti, people continued teasing you from Mayberry Opie. Still looking cute. A Paramount producer once told him, "We need a man, not America's kid." Ron smiled, thanked him, then walked to the parking lot and threw the script in a trash bin. He sat in his car until dark, staring into the rearview mirror and seeing someone who still hadn't escaped the child the public once adored. 2 years later, he wrote in a letter to an old friend, later quoted by Rolling Stone in The Forgotten Boys of Hollywood. "I don't dislike them. I dislike pretending it doesn't hurt. Here, if you don't smile, they say you're the problem." Ron lived like that for years, quiet, reserved, avoiding crowds. When American Graffiti won the Golden Globe, he smiled brightly on stage. But that night, according to his friend Don, Ron sat alone in his apartment, lights off, not saying a word for 3 hours. He wasn't drunk, just fractured. 20 years later, Harrison Ford sent him a letter. "I thought I was strong. Truth is, I just wasn't brave." Ron never replied. When asked why, he simply said, "I forgave. Forgetting is harder." From that humiliation, he began to understand who he would become. While directing Apollo 13, he reshot the scene of Tom Hanks losing control repeatedly, because the truest fear is when you must stay calm. For A Beautiful Mind, he had John Nash speak slowly during a belittling moment, almost whispering, "I'm fine." It was the same sentence Ron had told himself for years. Critic Janet Ross once wrote in The Atlantic, "Ron Howard's films are gentle, but if you listen closely, you can hear pain trembling beneath that gentleness." In 2025, at the launch of his memoir, 50 Years of Silence, Ron recounted everything for the first time. When he said, "I used to think silence earned respect, but really it allowed them to hurt me without apology." The room went quiet. No one dared applaud. A Guardian reporter wrote, "It wasn't a story, it was an obituary for his childhood." Opie shaming a phrase born from Ron Howard's life became a warning: Hollywood doesn't harm with fists, it harms with laughter. A harmless joke can echo as lifelong humiliation. For 50 years, every time he smiled on a red carpet, perhaps somewhere beneath the flashbulbs, was the faint echo of an old laugh from that summer night in 1973, when a red-haired teenager was locked in a trailer and learned the first lesson about the cost of silence. 2. I used to think that doing good work meant people would treat me fairly. Now I know that in Hollywood, kindness is the thing they value least. Ron Howard said that during a 2025 talk in Beverly Hills, remembering what people called the golden years of his life. His voice wasn't bitter, just tired. The kind of tired felt by someone who had smiled too long to hide the hurt. Because the truth is, during the years he was celebrated, Ron was also the one who was pushed aside the most. After American Graffiti 1973, the world labeled him the new face of American youth. The film earned $115 million, far beyond expectations, but Ron was paid only $10,000 a fixed fee with no revenue share. A year later, when the film was re-released and continued earning big, he approached George Lucas to request just 1% of the profits, worth over $1 million then. Lucas paused, then said coldly, "Ron, you're an actor, not an investor." The room chilled. Ron nodded, didn't argue, and left under the rain, his coat soaked. It was the last time they spoke as friends. In his 1974 journal, he wrote, "I thought fairness was natural. Now I know fairness is for those who shout loudest." After that disappointment, he moved on to Happy Days 1974-1980, the show that revived his career, but also revealed television's darker side. His role as Richie Cunningham was the heart of the show, the model of America's ideal son. Fans adored him so much, they sent thousands of letters to the studio. Yet 2 years later, ABC considered renaming the series Fonzie's Happy Days to capitalize on Henry Winkler's sudden rise. When Ron heard, he smiled weakly. "I'm not angry," he said at a press conference. But that night, he sat alone in his car outside the Burbank studio, engine off, for 3 hours. A single thought repeated in his mind: "I'm not interesting enough to keep my own show's name." On November 20th, 1976, he walked into a meeting with ABC executives and said, voice shaking but firm, "If you rename the show, I will leave tomorrow." When the news leaked, Variety ran the headline, "Ron Howard threatens to exit Happy Days," fans furious. Tens of thousands of letters flooded ABC in protest. Under pressure, they kept the original title. Ron stayed, and the show topped ratings again. Still, despite being its backbone, Ron earned 1/3 of Henry Winkler's salary, $25,000 per episode, versus Winkler's $75,000. A 1978 TV Guide article even mockingly called him the quiet hero of someone else's spotlight. Ron laughed when he read it, telling his wife, "I don't need to be a star, just respected." Slowly, he realized that in Hollywood, respect doesn't go to the quiet. The inequality wasn't just money. In the makeup room, whenever Winkler entered, the crew clapped and joked. The lights brightened. When Ron arrived, only a few nodded and the light dimmed back to pale yellow. Anson Williams, who played Potsy later, said Ron never complained. That's why people underestimated him. Silence looked like acceptance. But really it was fear. Fear that speaking up would earn him the deadly label "hard to work with." So Ron endured. After each episode, he drove around Burbank for hours, listening to country music, trying to believe things would improve. In 1977, Happy Days hit 31 million weekly viewers, earning ABC $50 million a year. Yet at its peak, Ron felt more isolated than ever. Script meetings no longer invited him. New posters featured only Fonzie. At a celebration dinner, a producer joked, "We should let Richie be the background. Everyone watches for Fonzie anyway." The table burst out laughing. Ron laughed too, though wine in his glass trembled and spilled onto his shirt. He was 23 then, young, famous, wealthy, but lonely. "I realized I was living inside a glass box," he said. "I could see everyone, but no one really saw me." Years later, during the Happy Days merchandising lawsuit, things returned to the old pattern. In 2012, supporting cast members sued CBS for $10 million over unpaid merchandise royalties. Ron didn't sue. He only sat quietly as colleagues, some long resentful, said bitterly, "We never got anything." In an interview with People, he simply answered, "Maybe because I didn't ask." During those years, Ron Howard learned a harsh truth. If you don't ask, they take everything. If you ask, they say you're the problem. And perhaps that is why later as a director, he worked quietly, no longer believing in the goodwill of an industry that once taught him that being gentle isn't a virtue, but a sentence. 3. I don't believe those accidents were random. In Hollywood, if blood is spilled and no one is held responsible, it means someone has been paid to stay quiet. That sentence, cold, slow sounding like both a confession and an accusation, was the moment Ron Howard stopped hiding what he had avoided for decades. People always saw him as a gentle, careful director who valued kindness. But few knew that behind every success was a line of accidents, lawsuits, and near-fatal moments he could never erase. In 1977, at the age of 23, Ron Howard directed his first film, Grand Theft Auto. A harmless car chase scene on the Riverside Freeway suddenly turned into disaster. The stunt car driven by Paul Bartel lost control, slammed into the barrier, and exploded. When they pulled Bartel out, blood soaked through the sand. He survived, but the injuries were permanent. Ron still remembers I was standing just a few meters away. The blast left me unable to hear for a full minute. I could only see smoke and the smell of burning fuel. A few days later, studio representatives arrived. No journalists, no police. A silent settlement worth $85,000 was signed, and the story vanished. But Ron kept a photo of that blood-stained concrete wall, evidence of a truth someone tried to erase. 13 years later, tragedy returned with Backdraft 1990. A movie about firefighters and courage ended up burning 3 crew members and scorching Kurt Russell's face. The warehouse scene in Chicago was supposed to be supervised by a safety team, but when the flames rose, the heat went beyond all calculations. They said the CO2 suppression system had a technical malfunction. Ron didn't believe it. A malfunction doesn't wait for golden hour, he said. It doesn't know when the camera is rolling. When OSHA began investigating, a young technician was blamed and fired. He disappeared immediately afterward. No one ever heard from him again. A year later, the Chicago Sun-Times reported that this technician had anonymously filed a complaint accusing the studio of cutting safety costs by removing controlled fire simulations. The article was taken down within 24 hours. Ron never spoke of it again, but in his notebook, Fire Notes, he wrote, "When the fire burned real, I saw someone smiling behind the smoke." By 1996, that shadow stepped off the film set and into his life. While directing Ransom, a film about kidnapping, Ron received threatening letters describing his son's exact school route. On February 14th, a photo of Cheryl, his wife, arrived at his office with the message, "Stop talking about the accidents." The FBI immediately stepped in. The Howard family was relocated in secrecy to Colorado for 3 months. A Los Angeles Times reporter wrote, "It was the first time a director of a kidnapping movie had to live like the victim in his own story." Ron didn't speak to the press, only to a few close friends. "I think someone wanted me to understand that I must not dig deeper." The investigation closed without a conclusion. But when he returned to set, the light in his films seemed colder, harsher, as though fear itself had seeped into the lens. People thought his bad luck had passed by the early 2000s. The Grinch 2000 was a children's film, bright, playful green. But even there, Ron faced a sudden flare-up, not from pyrotechnics, but from people. Jim Carrey, overwhelmed by the crushing makeup process, lost his temper, shoved Ron and shouted, "I'm not shooting anymore," in front of the whole crew. The next day, Universal halted production. The press called it a personal issue. But a set worker said in an anonymous interview Ron didn't get angry. He just looked around as if trying to see who had pulled the strings. That night, after everyone left, security guards found him still sitting alone in the empty soundstage, staring at the makeup chairs. They heard him whisper, "Someone is testing me." Then came A Beautiful Mind, 2001. A peaceful story about a mathematical genius became a real nightmare. Russell Crowe, known for his temper, threw a phone at the wall, shattering glass and injuring a crew assistant. The studio threatened fines, but 2 days later, everything disappeared. No reports, no features. It was only known that the insurance company was paying more than $500,000 per day to keep the production on schedule. In a behind-the-scenes recording leaked in 2023, Ron tells his assistant, "I don't know who's directing this anymore, me or the people behind the door." The parallels between his films and real life terrified him. Backdraft had fire. The crew was burned for real. Ransom was about kidnapping. He was threatened for real. A Beautiful Mind was about hallucinations. He began hearing phantom voices. A sound engineer once told Collider, After the final scene, he asked us to shut off all speakers because he heard someone whisper in the headset, "Keep shooting, they need more blood." Since then, every time he starts a new project, Ron performs a strange ritual, burning a strip of old film and tossing the ashes into a bucket of water. When asked why, he only said, "So, nothing else attaches to it." To this day, no one knows how much of it was real. But looking at what remains, settled lawsuits, sealed safety files, names of technicians erased from crew lists, people began asking, was Ron Howard just a director haunted by accidents? Or a puppet controlled by an invisible hand hiding in Hollywood's shadows? And maybe even he never knew the answer for sure. 4. I never hurt anyone, never disrespected anyone's faith. But because of one film, they made me live like someone on the run. Ron Howard said that during an interview with The Guardian in 2012, his voice was so hoarse they had to replay the tape to catch every word. It was no longer the exhaustion of a director, it was the voice of a man condemned for telling a story the world feared. In 2006, The Da Vinci Code premiered, and Ron Howard's life was never peaceful again. The movie, based on Dan Brown's novel, touched the ultimate taboo, suggesting that Jesus might have been married with descendants. Right after the first screening, the Vatican publicly condemned the film, calling it an offense to intellect and faith. On May 17, 2006, at Cannes, where the movie debuted, a bomb threat was sent to the Majestic Hotel where Ron was staying. The entire crew was evacuated at midnight. A witness recalled Ron sitting silently on the steps holding his head. Hours later, he was escorted by police to a private airport. The press called it the Khan's nightmare. On his way out, his phone buzzed non-stop, hundreds of threatening messages and emails, most from people claiming to be defenders of holy truth. One read, "Howard, you touched sacred blood. Blood will fall yours or someone who watches your film." When the movie opened in the US, the storm continued. Extremist groups held signs reading "Howard forsooth Judas" in front of theaters. In the Philippines, they burned effigies of him. In India, churches demanded a nationwide ban. In Rome, hundreds of monks marched around St. Peter's Square chanting prayers and holding up his picture with red letters, "Enemy of Faith." Ron Howard, who had made Cocoon a gentle film celebrating life and kindness, was now seen as a villain by millions. He traveled with bodyguards 24/7, could not publicly reveal his schedule, and even had to book hotels under fake names. Time magazine published a June editorial titled "Ron Howard and the Price of Doubt." They wrote, "No one is hated more than the one who questions belief." Howard made a film, but the world judged him as a betrayer. When he returned in 2009 with Angels and Demons, the storm grew again. The film touched the Vatican once more, this time involving an assassination plot. When Ron asked to film in major churches in Italy, the answer was icy silence. In May 2008, he flew to Rome to meet Vatican representatives. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. As soon as he finished speaking, a priest stood and said, "We cannot allow you to use God's house to dishonor God." The door closed behind him. The result, the production was banned from filming in all Italian churches. The crew had to rebuild the entire Vatican inside a Los Angeles soundstage, costing more than $50 million. Ron said during a press conference, "I only wanted to tell a story about faith and science, but they treated me like someone declaring war." When the film premiered, L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's official newspaper, published a commentary: "Ron Howard creates illusions, not truth." But he does not understand that illusions can be more dangerous than lies. That night, returning to his hotel, Ron found an unmarked letter slipped under the door. Inside was a picture of St. Peter, crying with a single sentence: "You will not be forgiven. In the years that followed, the wounds didn't heal, they deepened. While making The Dilemma 2011 a lighthearted comedy, another storm hit. In the trailer, Vince Vaughn's character joked, "Electric cars look so gay." A line meant as humor became explosive. LGBTQ+ groups, including GLAAD and Ellen DeGeneres, condemned it harshly. CNN, BBC, and the New York Times all criticized Ron for being insensitive and outdated. Boycott campaigns surged. A hashtag was born, Lass noch Canceln Howard. Ron was forced to issue a public apology on TV. In an NBC interview, he spoke slowly, each word clear. "I never intended to offend anyone. But if what I made hurt someone, then I am sorry." The host asked, "Will you remove the line from the film?" Ron looked into the camera. "No. Because if I start cutting out of fear, then I'm no longer an artist." His answer intensified the backlash. Variety ran the headline, "Ron Howard refuses to bow." But behind the scenes, an assistant revealed that after the taping, Ron sat in the makeup room, head in his hands, whispering, "Maybe I just signed the end of my own career." During those years, Ron Howard understood better than anyone what it felt like to be treated as the guilty one. He didn't do politics, didn't break laws, didn't start fights. He simply told stories he believed deserved to be told. Yet every time he touched a difficult truth, a new wall rose before him. When he spoke about faith, they called him offensive. When he spoke about identity, they called him indifferent. When he stayed silent, they called him weak. In a 2025 interview, Ron said softly, his gaze distant, "I used to think art was where we say the things we're afraid to say in life. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe art is only allowed to say what the world wants to hear." And perhaps that was what broke him the most. Not the lawsuits, not the threats, but being judged by the same people who once praised him. They had called him the director of compassion, yet when he dared to touch the shadowy corners of belief, they stoned him, as if he had betrayed humanity. An old friend once said, "Ron told me that if he could, he would make a movie about himself, about a man who believed in truth, then got burned alive by that very truth." And perhaps that is the one film Hollywood will never allow him to make. 5. Silence is the only language Hollywood is willing to pay to hear. That sentence, cold, short, and sharp as a blade cutting straight into the heart of the industry, was spoken by Ron Howard during a special interview with The New Yorker in August 2025. It was not just a confession, but a verdict. After half a century of being forced to smile, bow, thank everyone, and hide everything, the man once considered Hollywood's last gentle soul finally broke every boundary. And what he said left the entire industry stunned into silence. The interview took place in a small room in Los Angeles, dimly lit with no crew, no makeup, just Ron and a recorder. He no longer wore his familiar beanie. His hair was gray and messy, his voice hoarse, speaking slowly as if every word weighed as much as his past. "I kept quiet for 50 years, he said, because I thought I was protecting people. But really, I was just helping them hide what nobody dared to look at." Then he began to speak, no dodging, no defending. He spoke about being locked in a trailer and having beer bottles thrown at him by Harrison Ford and Paul Le Mat in 1973, calling it organized humiliation. He spoke about fatal on-set accidents that were settled with money and silence clauses. He spoke about studios sending thank you envelopes every time someone got hurt just to keep things calm. "There's nothing random in Hollywood," he said. "If someone falls off a wire, it's because someone cut it. If a fire burns hotter than planned, it's because they didn't want to pay for artificial smoke." The interviewer asked if he had proof. He laughed dryly. "You think any of it still exists? They bought the truth and burned it." Right after the interview was published, Hollywood trembled. Within 48 hours, 3 major studios announced they were pausing collaboration with Ron Howard. Variety called him a system traitor. A veteran director speaking anonymously to Deadline said, "He's destroying the trust between us and the audience. Some things should stay buried with history." Former colleagues remained silent. Henry Winkler, who had stood beside him throughout the Happy Days years, only wrote one short line on social media, heartbreaking but not surprising. No one publicly defended him. In just a few days, Ron Howard went from the hero of kindness to the disruptor of order. Netflix canceled the project he was directing. Disney withdrew distribution rights for Splash. Old awards removed his name from their promotional materials. The press dug up his old quotes, twisting them to portray him as a bitter man blaming his failures. While the world threw stones, Ron remained strangely silent. A week later, he appeared on 60 Minutes Thinner with eyes cold as glass. When the host asked, "Do you regret speaking out?" he replied, "Regret, yes. Because I know telling the truth here is no different from cutting my own survival contract." He paused for a moment, then looked straight into the camera. But I stayed silent too long. And Hollywood, the place that taught me how to act, also taught me that if I don't speak, I'll disappear in another way. The truth he revealed not only hurt the people involved, it exposed the operating system of the entire industry. Silence agreements, non-claim clauses, compassion payments to cover scandals, and deaths renamed as incidents. He mentioned 3 supporting actors who had died in the 1980s, whose names never appeared on any official fatality list. Part of the public supported him. The hashtag #BoschThankYourinHoward emerged with thousands sharing his line. Hollywood doesn't end people. It just makes them vanish. But the number of people attacking him was even larger. Late-night talk shows called him an old man losing clarity, while the Los Angeles Chronicle ran a long piece titled "Ron Howard and the Guilt After the Spotlight." People began to turn away. Friends avoided calling. His daughter, Bryce Dallas. Howard was cornered by reporters at her film premiere. "Do you believe your father is telling the truth?" She only answered, "I believe him." But Hollywood doesn't trust those who no longer serve it. Ron continued to speak, but less than before. He moved to a quiet place in Santa Barbara where part of Parenthood had been filmed. Every morning he walked along the beach carrying an old leather notebook where he wrote down the things he hadn't yet said. A neighbor shared. He still writes, but not scripts anymore. It's like he's recording his own farewell. And then, only a few months after the interview came out, Hollywood nearly erased his name from every list of influence. No tributes, no honors, no new films. But among audiences, his words remained like a wound that refused to heal. They taught me silence was golden. Now I understand that gold was meant to bury those who spoke. On October 1st, 2025, during a screening of A Beautiful Mind in New York, when Ron's image appeared at the end, the entire room stood and applauded. No one spoke, no one cried, just a different kind of silence. A silence heavier and more real than any scene he had ever directed. Ron Howard had finally broken the silence. But perhaps in Hollywood, truth has always been the most dangerous role. If you think Hollywood is all bright, think again. If you believe truth cannot be bought, look again at Ron Howard's story. Drop a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because I still have many truths to tell you, the ones Hollywood has tried to bury for 100 years. And maybe the next installment will change the way you see movies forever.